most important matter. Every day, the American public is bombarded with news about the Russian interference in our elections. Many of these reports are false and or misleading. Today is an opportunity to focus on the truth, and the truth can be only found through a full and fair investigation of all the facts. The committee has a vital duty to the American public to conduct comprehensive bipartisan oversight of the intelligence community and to follow the facts wherever they lead. To that end, your testimony today will greatly help us meet this solemn obligation. And with that, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Schiff, for 5 minutes for any opening comments that he would like to make. Adam?
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Director Brennan, and welcome. We thank you for coming before our committee and for your lifetime of service to the country. We woke today to the terrible news from Manchester that a suicide bomber killed and wounded scores of young people, including children enjoying music at a concert. It's difficult to describe the depravity of that act, let alone view the images of the carnage which has now been claimed by ISIS. We know that your colleagues in the intelligence community are doing everything they can to share information with the British and working day and night to prevent such attacks from again plaguing our own country. We thank them and the brave servicemen and women fighting this scourge of terror in places like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. 2 months ago, our committee held its first open hearing with then FBI Director Comey and NSA Director Rogers. Because Mr. Comey was responsible for investigating whether U.S. persons were involved in the Russia hacking of our election, many of our questions at that hearing went to the issue of collusion. It was at that hearing that Director Comey first revealed that the FBI had opened a foreign counterintelligence investigation of people associated with the Trump campaign in July of last year, and that this investigation was ongoing. Director Comey and Rogers also repudiated the President's contention that he was the subject of an illegal wiretapping operation orchestrated by his predecessor. Today we'll hear the testimony of former CIA Director John Brennan, who had the responsibility to determine Russia's plans and intentions in the United States and around the world. Those plans involved an unprecedented attack on our democratic institutions, and those intentions included a desire to tear down our democracy, and more than that, a wish to undermine the candidacy of Hillary Clinton and advance the prospects that Donald Trump would become President of the United States. The audacity of the Russian intervention in our election took most Americans by surprise. And today we will look to Director Brennan to inform us when the CIA first learned that the Russians intended to do more than gather foreign intelligence and were intent on weaponizing the data by publishing it at critical times during the campaign. What accounts for the Russian willingness to interfere in such a brazen way? What were they hoping to accomplish, and why were they willing to run the risk of getting caught? Did the Russians believe that the U.S. government response would be so muted that they could get away with it and pay little price? Since the decision to intervene in our election came from the very top levels of the Kremlin, was Putin himself encouraged by then-candidate Trump's call for the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's emails and his promise that they would be richly rewarded for doing so? While the CIA's mission is to gather foreign intelligence, we will also want to explore with Director Brennan what the agency may have learned about the issue of U.S. person involvement in the Russian operation and can share in open session, about how the Russians may have identified or targeted U.S. persons to secure their assistance or co-opt them, and what mechanism was established, if any, for the sharing of information between elements of the intelligence community and the FBI. Our agencies have concluded that the Russian attack on our democracy was not a one-off, and they will do so again. In fact, the Russians are already employing many of the same tactics in Europe. We will want to know the Director's views of the broader Russian aims and what we can do to stop them. Finally, the disruption of our democracy that the Russians sought to provoke continues to reverberate throughout our government. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, several matters have been alleged that are of grave concern to our committee and the public that have a direct bearing on our investigation and the relationship between the President and the intelligence community. It is alleged that the President shared sensitive and classified information with the Russians that was provided by one of our intelligence partners. It is alleged that the President urged Director Comey to lay off the investigation of Michael Flynn and asked the Director to pledge his loyalty. Most recently, it is alleged that the President weighed in with the Directors Rogers and Coates and urged them to rebut the issue of collusion, and that his staff asked personnel at those agencies to lobby Director Comey to drop the Flynn case. And significantly, it was admitted by the President himself that the Russia probe was the primary motivation behind his firing of Mr. Comey. If accurate, these events would have taken place shortly after you left the CIA. but as I imagine you must have maintained many relationships with the incredible workforce at the CIA and elsewhere where you served for many decades, we will be interested to learn whether members of the intelligence community have shared information with you that corroborates any of these allegations, and how you assess the conduct of the administration may be impacting the ability of our agencies to gather critical information from our partners and the ability of the FBI to carry out its investigation free from interference. And last, I want to say a word about the appointment of Mr. Mueller as special counsel. Many of us have known Director Mueller for many years and have the utmost respect for him. But I take sharp issue with those who have suggested that his appointment, as important as it was to ensure public confidence in the conduct of the DOJ investigation, somehow obviates the need for our own congressional probe. Our investigation and Mr. Mueller's have two very different but equally important objects. His will ultimately determine whether any U.S. laws were broken and who should be brought to justice if they were. And ours will be to determine the whole scope of Russian intervention in which U.S. person involvement is but one part, whether our response was adequate, what steps need to be taken to protect us in the future, and importantly, to make many of our hearings and findings public, since a well-informed electorate is our only sure defense. I thank the Chairman, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Brennan, do you have an opening statement?
Yes, sir, I do.
You're recognized.
Thank you. Representative Conaway, Representative Schiff, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. As you know, I served as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency from March 2013 to January of this year, as Assistant to President Obama for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism from 2009 to 2013, and as a CIA officer from 1980 to 2005. I am currently serving as a part-time senior advisor at Kissinger Associates. I'd like to express my deepest condolences, like you, to the British people and to the families of those killed and injured in yesterday's heinous attack against innocents in Manchester. I am confident that intelligence, security, and law enforcement officers from the United Kingdom, United States, and other countries are actively working to find those responsible and to prevent further attacks, and I wish them Godspeed. Congress and the American people have already heard from former and current U.S. officials intimately involved in uncovering Russian attempts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, notably from former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, former Director of the FBI James Comey, former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates, and NSA Director Admiral Mike Rogers. Rather than repeating details contained in their testimonies, I will use this opportunity to make three main points before I take your questions. First, I'm exceptionally proud of the work done by the women and men of the CIA, who, along with their talented colleagues from the FBI, NSA, and the Office of the DNI, tracked and exposed Russian active measures against our presidential election. When it became clear to me last summer that Russia was engaged in a very aggressive and wide-ranging effort to interfere in one of the key pillars of our democracy, we pulled together experts from CIA, NSA, and FBI in late July to focus on the issue, drawing in multiple perspectives and subject matter experts with broad expertise to assess Russian attempts to interfere in the U.S. presidential election. The purpose was to ensure that experts from key agencies had access to information and intelligence relevant to Russian actions so that we could have as full an appreciation as possible on the scope, nature, and intentions of this Russian activity. The experts provided regular updates and assessments through the summer and fall, which were used to inform senior U.S. officials, including President Obama. Their work also was leveraged for the intelligence community assessment that was completed in early January under the aegis of the Director of National Intelligence. Second, it should be clear to everyone that Russia brazenly interfered in our 2016 presidential election process, and that they undertook these activities despite our strong protests and explicit warning that they not do so. Along these lines, on 4 August of last year, I spoke to Alexander Bortnikov, the head of Russia's Federal Security Bureau, the FSB, Russia's internal security and intelligence service. The bulk of the scheduled call focused on Syria, as Mr. Bortnikov was my principal Russian interlocutor on terrorism matters. In consultation with the White House, I took the opportunity to raise 2 additional issues with him. I first told Mr. Bortnikov, as I had several times previously, that the continued mistreatment and harassment of U.S. diplomats in Moscow was irresponsible, reckless, intolerable, and needed to stop. Over the years, it has been Mr. Bortnikov's FSB that has been most responsible for this outrageous behavior. I next raised the published media reports of Russian attempts to interfere in our upcoming presidential election. I told Mr. Bortnikov that if Russia had such a campaign underway, it would be certain to backfire. I said that all Americans, regardless of political affiliation or whom they might support in the election, cherish their ability to elect their own leaders without outside interference or disruption. I said American voters would be outraged by any Russian attempt to interfere in the election. Finally, I warned Mr. Bortnikov that if Russia pursued this course, it would destroy any near-term prospect for improvement in relations between Washington and Moscow and would undermine constructive engagement, even on matters of mutual interest. As I expected, Mr. Bortnikov denied that Russia was doing anything to influence our presidential election, claiming that Moscow is a traditional target of blame by Washington for such activities. He said that Russia was prepared to work with whichever candidate wins the election. When I repeated my warning, he again denied the charge, but said that he would inform President Putin of my comments. I believe I was the first U.S. official to brace the Russians on this matter. Third, through the so-called Gang of Eight process, we kept Congress apprised of these issues as we identified them. Again, in consultation with the White House, I personally briefed the full details of our understanding of Russian attempts to interfere in the election to congressional leadership, specifically Senators Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, Dianne Feinstein, and Richard Burr, and to Representatives Paul Ryan, Nancy Pelosi, Devin Nunes, and Adam Schiff between 11 August and 6 September. I provided the same briefing to each of the Gang of Eight members. Given the highly sensitive nature of what was an active counterintelligence case involving an ongoing Russian effort to interfere in our presidential election, the full details of what we knew at the time were shared only with those members of Congress, each of whom was accompanied by one senior staff member. The substance of those briefings was entirely consistent with the main judgments contained in the January classified and unclassified assessments, namely that Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton and harm her electability and potential presidency, and to help President Trump's election chances. Let me conclude by saying that it was a very special privilege to serve as a CIA officer for the first 25 years of my public service, and it was the highest honor of my professional career, and always will be, to have served another 4 years as director of CIA. CIA officers of all disciplines, past, present, and future, serve this country and their fellow citizens with tremendous dedication, talent, and courage. They recognize that this country's national security rests heavily on their continued outstanding work and on the sacrifices they and their families make every day on behalf of their fellow citizens. We all owe a great debt of gratitude to all CIA officers and their families for what they have done and continue to do to protect this country. And I will now be pleased to take your questions.
Well, again, Mr. Brennan, thank you very much for your long service, distinguished, and for agreeing to come this morning. I'm joined on our task force by two able prosecutors who I'd like to yield my 5 minutes to Tom Rainey. Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, if you could just take a quick minute before I start with my line of questioning with regard to what happened last night in Manchester, to do whatever you can, the best you can from your expert opinion to try to reassure the American people that what we do in this country and what we're trying to do would help thwart and stop any kind of similar activity here in the future. If you could help try to put American minds at ease briefly, I would appreciate any words that you might have of advice.
Well, I would say that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their terrorist affiliates continue to try to carry out these outrageous attacks in Europe as well as in the United States. But I can say with great confidence that this country has the absolute best counterterrorism community that knits together the experts from intelligence, law enforcement, homeland security, and does a great job of making sure that our federal structure is interoperating as best it can with state and local officials and local law enforcement. And so I have seen a tremendous growth of capability as well as in enhanced national architecture since 9/11 in terms of the ability to share counterterrorism information quickly, terrorist threat information, so that when it's collected overseas or wherever, it gets to those individuals who have to take action on it. So I can assure the American people that I know today my former colleagues are working even harder than they ever had before to prevent attacks.
Thank you, sir. And to the matter at hand, we heard the ranking member speak in his opening, as well as we've heard in the press numerous times with regard to, and in your opening statement, the Russian investigation, what the Russians were trying to do with regard to our election, the Russians interfering with our election, whether it be through the RT or propaganda or whatever. We know that that has now, unfortunately, become the new norm and something that we're all going to have to deal with. And our charge on this committee isn't so much necessarily to try to seek out and root out criminal behavior, especially now in light of the new special counsel, Robert Mueller, who would be looking into those type of things. But for us on the intelligence committees, whether it be here or in the Senate, to try to improve the intelligence community's ability to do our jobs and to make a report, a recommendation to you and the new administration as to how we better defend ourselves against what Russia and or others may be trying to do with regard to affecting our republic and our democracy. And in doing so, if we do find any kind of criminal behavior, I think that the minority would agree that those type of that type of information would be referred to the Justice Department, which is the proper jurisdiction.